10 weapons that changed the history of warfare. Number 10. The AK-47. Now if I asked you to name the first gun that comes to mind, I'd be willing to bet that it's the AK-47. That's because it's the most widely produced gun in history, with over 100 million made in total and 75 million in existence right now. That's 20% of all firearms worldwide. The AK-47 was invented in 1947 by Russian General Mikhail Kalashnikov as a cheap weapon for the Soviet army, hence where it gets its other name, Kalashnikov. From its first use, the gun exploded in popularity across the USSR, thanks to its rugged construction, ease of production, and relative lack of moving parts. That means it was incredibly reliable and simple to maintain. Even people who had never used a gun could field strip one with ease after minimal training. But that prevalence means that Kalashnikovs are commonly used by terrorists and militia groups worldwide. Now, since they are so cheap and reliable, countries across Asia and Africa engage in widespread illegal arms trades. Number 9. The bow and arrow. Most people nowadays probably think of Legolas, Hawkeye or Katniss Everdeen when they picture bows and arrows, but they actually have massive historical significance, possibly dating back as far as 64,000 years. Classical civilizations like the ancient Egyptians, Assyrians and Hebrews were known to have made wide use of longbows, and they even showed up throughout every continent except Australia. But it's not just their ubiquity that's interesting. Stony Brook University biologists Paul Bingham and Joanne Souza have coined the social coercion hypothesis, which is the idea that more powerful weapons encourage civilizations to group together out of the threat of being killed by them. In other words, you're probably going to follow the person who points a load of lethal weapons in your face. Multiple researchers have pointed to that effect in Native American tribes, who became much less divided and developed more complex societies after bows showed up in around 500 AD. Number 8. Drones. Unmanned aerial vehicles hold a special place on this list. That's because they haven't just changed military history, but they're doing it as I speak. Let's back up for a second though. The US military was developing drone technology as early as the 1960s, though that technology didn't really catch up until about 3 decades later. But it wasn't long until drones were put to use. The first ever Predator drone attack on Afghan insurgents in 2002 was a major turning point in military technology. It was the first ever instance that a remote attack was made in real time, and as technology develops, it could see future warfare that entirely skips ground troops altogether. I mean, why risk friendly lives when you don't have to? But drones have been fiercely criticised as long as they've been used, thanks to their capacity for indiscriminate killing and the numbing effects some soldiers have described from killing through a screen. Number 7. The trebuchet. You might think ancient conflicts were all about soldiers, swords and cavalry, but there's a lot to be said for artillery, and there might be no more important example of early artillery than the trebuchet. Perfecting on the catapult and the ballista, the trebuchet was first invented in 4th century China as a tool for siege warfare. After its introduction in 6th century Europe, it eventually became a staple of medieval warfare. Before trebuchets were widely used, castles were pretty much impenetrable, but thanks to its long range and high weight capacity, it was capable of hurling projectiles to breach even fortified walls. That meant that instead of taking their chances waiting for defending armies to starve, siege warfare became a lot more proactive. Invaders could push the issue by breaking through defences, or if they felt really adventurous, they were known to have pelted disease-ridden corpses over the castle walls to speed things up. Number 6. Tanks. They don't quite hold the prestige they used to, thanks to defences like anti-tank missiles, but for decades, these behemoth weapons were the pinnacle of wartime tech. Weirdly enough, the first idea came from Leonardo da Vinci, whose so-called fighting vehicle bore more resemblance to a UFO than anything else. Conspiracy? Probably not. Tanks were first developed by British engineers during World War I in 1914. They actually got that name from their disguise, since the people working on them were told they were building water tanks. But from their first use in 1916 in the Battle of the Somme, they redefined trench warfare. Before then, battles overwhelmingly favoured the defender, since it was so difficult to break the lines of a trench with foot soldiers. But with the advent of armed vehicles, it was possible to break through the lines with relative ease. German soldiers were even documented fleeing from the scene of the first tank attack. Number 5. The sword. It's hard to think of a more iconic ancient weapon than the sword. To most people, they're the epitome of the age of knights, kingdoms and gruesome duels. Swords are conventionally thought to have been invented between the 2nd and 3rd millennia BC. In other words, the Bronze Age. There's evidence from Turkey though, which suggests that they could go as far back as 3,300. In any case, those early swords were a huge development, but not all that widely used. since bronze swords tended to be either brittle enough to shatter or flexible enough to bend out of shape. But once the Iron Age rolled around, everything changed, since blades became much stronger and could pretty much be mass-produced. That meant that battles became a lot shorter and a lot bloodier than the spear and knife fights of old, and any group with the means to mass-produce them had the fear-inducing authority to subjugate others with ease. Number 4. The hand cannon. It's pretty hard these days to imagine warfare without guns, so it'd be weird not to talk about the first ever firearm. Those guns, called hand cannons, originated in 13th century China and were widely used in warfare before spreading to the West in the following decades. But they weren't exactly guns in the sense that we understand. They literally worked like cannons by igniting gunpowder to pelt out stones. Once they reached Europe, however, they marked a major change in medieval combat. Before then, you could be pretty sure that your suit of armour would keep you protected, but that's not so true when an infantryman could fire a projectile fast enough to rip a hole through your chest. But hand cannons weren't just for anyone. They needed specific training to use, which had the knock-on effect that armies began to be made up of less expendable peasant fighters and more trained soldiers. Number 3. Chlorine gas. Now everyone knows that war is hell, so it takes a special type of weapon to get banned in all forms. That's the case with chemical weapons, which were internationally banned from warfare in all forms in 1993, and it started with chlorine gas. Chlorine was first isolated as a chemical in the 1700s, and from then on it was mostly used for bleaching and sterilizing. But in April 1915, chlorine gas was first used by German forces in Ypres as part of World War I. The 10,000 gas canisters released onto Allied trenches caused 15,000 casualties, a third of which died. The first use of chlorine gas completely opened up the field of war. Suddenly, there was a weapon that could disable or kill thousands with slow, agonizing symptoms like fluid in the lungs and widespread blisters. Nowadays, chemical weapons are mostly used illegally by ruthless dictators, more recently by President Assad in Syria. Number 2. The spear. Where would we be without the first ever weapon? If it wasn't for the spear, there's a good chance early man would never have escaped its many ancient predators. In fact, sharpened rocks on sticks have been used for so long in combat that they predate modern Homo sapiens by quite some way. In 2012, archaeologists discovered the earliest evidence of spears in Kathupan in South Africa. Those sharpened stones suggest that Homo heidelbergensis was crafting spears to hunt over 500,000 years ago. Long after those times, spears kept their place as one of the most important weapons around the world, since they are incredibly easy to make and, of course, deadly in the right hands. Warriors and soldiers from ancient Greece to Native America to medieval Europe had their own takes on them, like the sarissa, the lance, and the polearm. Every type of spear made its mark in the history of weapons, quite literally. Number 1. Nuclear weapons. There's no way it could be anything else. In terms of immediate impact, there hasn't been a greater change in the course of warfare than with nuclear weapons. It all started when Lisa Meitner and Otto Frisch pioneered nuclear fission in 1938. 4 years later, the Manhattan Project perfected the first nuclear bomb in 1945. As we all know, that led to the infamous attacks on Hiroshima and Nagasaki that same year. Those attacks probably killed more than 200,000 people between them and had a major impact on Japan's decision to surrender. Over the course of the Cold War, there was the idea of mutually assured destruction, or MAD. In other words, if one country nukes another, it's pretty much guaranteed to get nuked back. That pushed conflicts away from all-out war and towards much more tactical affairs. That was 10 weapons that changed the history of warfare. Which one do you think had the biggest impact? Were there any we missed from this list? Let us know in the comments and make sure to like and subscribe. While you're at it, check out this great all-time 10s on screen now.